welcome to, what number is this podcast?
Number 7.
Number 7. We're on a roll now, heading downhill faster as we go. But we are on location still, only in chapter 6 today. Again, we're on the north shores of the Sea of Galilee. Want to talk about some really pertinent issues. I think some things we can maybe make application to where we're at as a church and what's going on in our culture. Matt threw out last week that you could ask us any question that you wanted.
I was hoping for some really good questions, but conversation quickly changed.
Yeah, we get the same question over and over again, which is?
The question from about 5 different people was, when are we going to reopen? So
let's talk about our preferred language in response to this, guys. Are we going to reopen?
We are not reopening because we were never closed.
You can only reopen what has been closed. The church isn't closed.
Nope.
Yeah, we've been telling people that we are regathering, we are returning to worship at some point.
Returning to worship, returning to gathering.
Yeah. I think that's a really important distinction because I don't know about you guys, but I have experienced more people that were on the fringe, experienced the Church Online platform. Some of them have been baptized, so like we're far from closed.
Yeah,
ministry is still happening.
I was gonna say I get texts, every other day or so of groups, being on mission there, and so nothing's stopped, nothing has closed. So we're just gonna have the opportunity to come back together and celebrate what God has done in and through us.
Ben, if you could encapsulate what you wanted to communicate in your sermon from this past weekend, Luke chapter 5, the calling of the disciples, what was the emphasis of your message there?
As it pertains to this issue we're referring to? So it kind of stemmed from a meeting that I had in Clay County this last, I guess would be at the airing of this, 2 weeks ago. And we were highlighting the procedures and policies that we were going to institute to return to service. And I'm just fatigued with that language. I mean, everybody is. We're just tired
told
of
people
talking
to
about
use
it.
that language.
Use that, but no. What I mean by that is, I'm just
plans and procedures.
Yes,
and all that.
It's just
nonsense.
It's just tiring. But the point I made with that was the moderator of the meeting, one of the elders at one of the local churches, did a really good job by asking, "What is your outlook on the future of the church because of this?" And it was in that moment that I didn't say a whole lot the first part of the meeting. The second part, I felt like we need to understand that God has still been doing some really cool things in the midst of the church, not just Christ Church, but the local and global church as a whole. And so a couple of things I pointed out in my sermon this last week was we just in our body of believers have seen dads who have felt that they can lead their families. They've relied on the church for a long time just because they were comfortable, but they've realized I can lead my families well spiritually, or at least start that process. We've had families who didn't know how to engage their kids in spiritual conversations, and they're leading devotions every single week in their homes. And we've also seen baptisms. I think we totaled maybe 10. I don't know. For the sake of this, we'll say it was 10. But
if it wasn't 10, you heard it here.
It was probably more. But the point of that is we've seen people giving their lives to Christ. And so the way I combat the people asking, when is the church going to reopen? Man, here's the proof that the church is never closed. And in fact, I think Jesus has removed a lot of distractions. You said it really well 3 weeks ago. Like, for a long time, by our actions, we've declared the church is non-essential anyways. But through all of this, Jesus has removed a lot of those distractions, and we're seeing him do some really cool things when that's stripped away. So, I'm optimistic about the future of the church so long as we don't decide that, okay, because we're returning to service, all of this responsibility of leading my family and engaging them in worship and conversations is going to shift back to us, the staff and the elders. That cannot happen.
How have you seen this in groups, Andrew? It's playing out.
Well, both local and global. So I just got off a FaceTime call with one of our missionaries in Belgium, and they were telling me the fact that they've had to rethink how they do ministry, but in fact, the people they're reaching has actually grown by about 4 or 5 times in their community, both in children. It started with kind of a children's ministry thing they did online, and that grew into families, and how like groups have been forming around these new ways. And so like new ways of ministry are good, for the gospel to be able to be spread, and whenever it's reaching more people. So both globally, but then locally too. Matt and I were at a group on Friday night, and
Of 10 or less.
yeah, 10 or less, and like groups are loving each other. They're serving one another. They're developing those relationships. They're in God's word. They're growing, and I think it's going to be a prime time for relationships to really even go to the next level. And so, yeah, our groups have been after it. They've been serving one another and loving on each other. It's been a positive experience, because it kind of weeded out, in my mind, some of the non-essential things, like what do we really have to have church? And, like we've been able to worship together. It's been different, right? So it'll be good whenever we come back together. It'll be fun.
And for clarity's sake, like we want to be together.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
I think that's been kind of the thing, is like we've taken some heat individually online from different people, and that is just, it's bothered me, because it's like, yeah, we want to be together, but we understand that God is still working in an incredible way,
Yeah.
and we're getting a front row seat at that.
Absolutely. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be actually really exciting coming into this summer, and the relationships and worship is going to be positive.
Jeff said it
So-
well I'm cutting you off, sorry. You said it really well at the end of Church Online this weekend about the 1/3. You broke them down.
Yeah, there's such a diversity of opinion, and what I think has happened, and I mentioned to you guys in a meeting we had this morning. I think it's going to be a year or more before we really know the full effect of what has transpired in the last 12 weeks. There is good and bad going to come out of this, and we just have to stick to the purpose of what God has called us to do, to be disciples who make disciples, and really make that the point of emphasis, because that carries on generationally. That's what we have seen the church be able to do, since Jesus called these guys to come and follow him, and be fishers of men. That has lasted. Everything else has changed. And I feel like we as a church this has accelerated what was going to happen anyway.
You're absolutely right.
In America, we were drifting faster than I think we realized away from an emphasis culturally and by people's choice on what the church does and what it means in their life. I think this may be a blessing in the sense that we're wide awake now as to changes that are transpiring, and maybe because it's not been a slow drift, we can stem the tide and make an impact. But the church, and I speak not, let's say the congregation that determines all we need to do is get back to what we were doing, they're done.
Yeah.
Maybe not immediately done, but they're done, because times have changed. People have changed. This is an opportunity to evaluate, how am I going to make disciples that make disciples? And not that we've got that figured out, but we're working for that end. A lot of church has been about just getting back to doing church, which almost all of those folks say every week. We're not. We're not at church. We are the church, right?
I love the subtle
But that's what we do.
shift in voice. But you're exactly right.
I could get wound up about that, because I see a lot of people in a lot of settings doing exactly what we're going to see in the story.
Yep.
And Luke 6.
Yep. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm going to jump into the story real quick, because I think we want to see the context from Scripture that applies to what we're talking about. It's the Pharisees gathering in the synagogue in Capernaum or Chorazin or Bethsaida, probably one of those three. And it says in verse 7 and 8 of chapter 6 that they're waiting to see if Jesus will do a miracle on the Sabbath. There is a blatant problem there. They acknowledge he's going to do a miracle. Dismissed. But will it be on the Sabbath?
And that's all they care about.
That's all they care about. will it mess up their Sabbath routine?
Yep.
So let's go back for a little bit, because we can do that here in this environment, and talk about the Sabbath, where that came about, what was meant to be, and how what God instructed and intended turned into a mess,
Mhm.
a total off-topic mess for the people of Israel.
Well, I mean, you think about the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested, right? And so,
So it
think
goes all
that's-
the way back to creation.
And I think that's
Yeah.
a really good point, because a lot of times we read the word Sabbath in our Bible and we don't really know what that means.
We think church.
We think church. It's a day of rest that was on Saturday, is still on Saturday for Jewish people.
Mhm.
Still gather together and celebrate that. Lots of laws, lots of religious things that you could and could not do on the Sabbath. I think it's important for us to know what that means.
but I mean, originally it's meant for us to have a reflection and a remembrance of what God has done,
Yep.
and that He is our source of strength. He's our provider, and so we don't have to be the ones to work 7 days a week. Like, He is the one who provides, and we can rest because He is good. And so, like, that's the whole point of the Sabbath. And then you see Judaism develop all these things that you talked about there. All these, they've added to it to quote unquote protect it, but in protecting it, they've added things that are like burdensome, when really it's supposed to be a day of rest and rejoicing in what God has done, and He's our source of strength and provider.
Let's give some real world examples from our time in Israel. Things that we've seen, things that you've seen on your
No
trips. like-
falafels on
that's criminal. But
or shawarma.
I know before we all went, you had talked about some of the things that were just ridiculous that they have in place in order to protect the Sabbath.
Well, for instance, when Jesus heals the man who had been carried in on a mat, laid on a mat, unable to walk, paralytic, the complaint was not that he was healed or that he's walking, because there was a certain prescription about the distance that could be a walk, but it's that he's carrying his mat. Over their heads that he's healed
Could care less.
blows my mind.
Hey, do you know how many miracles Jesus actually did on the Sabbath?
I was wondering that.
Well, most of them are on the Sabbath.
I was going to say, if you look through Scripture, most of the miracles happen on the Sabbath. I think Jesus might be telling us something there.
The thing that I think is interesting is that he just keeps pushing back, and that he's doing things that they don't understand, and they're mostly concerned the fact that he's not obeying the law.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause
Their
he's not-
laws.
Well, that's what I
Their
mean.
laws. Yeah,
And I think that's really important, because they're adding to it,
So,
right?
So let's talk
It's
about some
religion.
things like Ben
Yeah.
said that we saw. For instance, when you go into a multi-level motel, or would that be a hotel?
That would be a hotel. I
Sure.
think.
Either
Whatever.
one. And you're going to ride the elevator.
I forgot
There
about this.
are Shabbat elevators that stop on every floor, and they open automatically, and it's all preset so that you don't have to push a button, because when you push a button, the electricity causes a spark. A spark is a fire, and you can't start a fire on the Sabbath.
Same
Wow.
thing with hand dryers, too.
So the
Toilets.
urinals at the place that I stayed at one time along the Sea of
What
Galilee,
is going on?
Wow, where have we gone all of a
Okay.
sudden? Okay.
above the urinal was a sign to use this facility is to facilitate sin on the Sabbat. Because it had an automatic flusher.
When
on
you
the
gotta
urinal.
go, you gotta go.
Right.
Right. But you caused a spark by peeing. And by causing the spark, it's sin.
Oh, we could cut this out. Goodness.
true.
That's insane.
But the ridiculous nature of the application of these laws, I read recently from a Jewish person that said the Sabbath is actually the hardest day of the week.
Hmm.
Because the rest and reflection is gone. It's all about trying to make sure you don't mess up. So you start your meal for the Sabbath beforehand, because it can be cooking when the Sabbath begins, but it can't start once the Sabbath is there. Just things like that.
Yeah, it's become a day of rules rather than a day of reflection that it was meant to be.
So reflecting on when I was a kid, a lot of great impact in my home church. A lot of people, and the impact they poured into my life and things I learned. But I can close my eyes and I could tell you the order of the service, how many verses of each song we would sing, what would happen, and it became. I don't know if they're that way anymore or not, but it became such a pattern to change any of the pattern would have like caused a major upheaval in the church. You guys experience like that?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
You grew up in a city, Matt.
I was gonna say, was that like, because I know some of it maybe just be one person on staff. Was it that
No.
or okay?
Well, these are the ones person on staff, but it is.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. Is like, was it convenience or was it what was it?
I think it's comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think, and we're all that way. We're comfortable with what we've experienced previously. We will repeat that again and again and again, and we could easily lose the reason. Probably we sing the first and the second and the last verse of every song because there was some song that the third verse was bad.
Yeah.
And so you quit singing the third verse of that one. Pretty soon you don't sing third verse of any of them.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought that was strange as a kid.
Yep.
I'd read the third verse just to see is there
Yeah.
why don't we sing it? Why do they write that?
I did not know that.
We had an elder at the church that I grew up in.
What's his
and,
name?
Oh, he's deceased, so it's not relevant. But no, he had the same prayer every single time we had communion, and it got to the point where it was almost a joke because I could recite his prayer, and I still remember like the first two lines of it, and that was
Joke.
25 years ago, you know. But
Maybe he was like teaching you to pray, man.
I'd
Like,
say,
yeah,
And
Lord's
you gotta
Prayer
be
is the
careful-
same.
I
You have
didn't
to be
learn a lot.
careful judging the heart of that.
Sure.
But what happens as an effect is we stop thinking, we stop,
Mhm.
It was
We
just
saw-
robotic.
and
Yep.
we stop adapting to the change of our culture. And then when somebody does change something, we freak out. We forget that it's the principle hasn't changed, but the practice has.
so
I know that you talk about it like this a bunch.
Well, yeah, I never get tied to the methods. I talk about that to our leaders all the time. Like, we need to be laser focused on our mission and vision. But when it comes to the actual methods, I mean, Sunday school worked great for a lot of years, and it was super effective. Like, you were training people, teaching them God's word, but it got to a point where it became another thing of the church, and we were holding on to it for the sake of holding on to it. And some churches still are, like life groups are a great thing for us right now, but like that's facilitating what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to accomplish disciples making disciples. And so for us right now, that's the best application and atmosphere. So the methods are going to change over time, but the principles, the mission, the vision should always stay the same, and that's making disciples who make
And if
disciples.
we haven't learned that in the last 12 weeks,
Yeah.
I don't know what, I mean,
And so you see Jesus in the story healing, and they are so tied to their methods of
Mhm.
how every Sabbath has to be that when he comes on the scene, he's like wrecking all their systems. And basically what is really happening, he's undermining their authority and power. And Jesus is saying, like, my kingdom's not of this world, and like, I'm here to bring freedom. We saw that in Luke 3. I have come to give freedom to the oppressed, and give sight to the blind. He's declaring by affirming that Isaiah scroll of what he's come to do. And man, you talk about shaking the earth and shaking up power structures. That's what Jesus is doing.
I love when he says in verse 5 of chapter 6, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And it's such a slap in the face to the establishment there that, hey, just because these are the rules that you've put in place does not mean that my deity, my power takes a break on the Sabbath as well. I
Yeah.
love that response.
They're so concerned at defending the Sabbath. I am the Sabbath.
Yeah.
and they're missing it in front of their own eyes.
Yep.
So I reflectively, I got a birthday next week. I hope you'll bring me an ice cream cake or
What
something.
day? What day is it?
June 1st.
I can't remember. It's the
How-
6th of
You're in
June.
a safe
Are you
place.
60?
Yeah.
You get the AARP discount yet?
I get mail from the AARP.
Well, and
But I
we
shouldn't.
We all get mail from AARP.
No, I don't.
I do.
Oh, yeah, I got one a couple years ago.
I'll be 51.
51.
So I recognize in that, I've had a real hard time the last 12 weeks because for 30 years I did the same thing. And my big fear when I read this passage and when I reflect upon the past 12 weeks and when we talk about things changing is that I don't want to be like those guys in the story who are blinded by the midst of God, blinded with God in their midst. He's standing in their synagogue. He's performing miracles in their presence. God is on the move, and they missed it. I don't want to be that.
Yeah.
How do we keep our eyes open to what God is doing in our tradition?
So you've told the story lots of times about Pauline Greenwood and the music. Music was a
Yeah.
big thing in the late 90s,
Wonder-
early
Pauline
2000s.
would probably be 100 now.
Yeah.
Close.
And, and she recognized she didn't really like the new worship music that was coming out and we were playing it a little bit louder and, all that stuff going on. But I really believe she had the right attitude there. Like, if that's going to help people develop their relationship with God and worship, then I'm okay with that. Even if I don't like it personally, I'm okay if that's going to move us closer and more people to come to know and worship God. I mean, that's it. That's the heart right there.
Such a sweet lady in that she was concerned about the next generation.
Yep.
Always. And then after she made that statement, she looked at me. I was sitting in her living room interviewing her. She looks at me and she says, "And they play what I like on TV." And she just has this belly rolling laugh. And she just laughed for 20 seconds, So I'm old and gone is what she's saying. But I want Jesus to live on.
Yep.
I think that's the thing is like the majority of the, those type of comments come from this thought of self first. And I think we always got to be very careful because these guys are concerned about protecting their Sabbath that they have added to. And it's about them protecting what they have built or what they want to build. It's power. And they're missing Jesus in front of them.
I think we all have to be careful of that.
Yeah.
Every single one of us. Because it's so easy to get stuck in a form, and this is how we worship. This is how we do things. Man, yeah, I'm with you. I'm kind of like, you always got to check yourself because I don't want to get to 60 or 51.
It's going to happen
61,
fast. It's going to
70.
happen fast.
I know. And
You'll still be
and be like,
rocking
this
and-
is how we have to do it. I don't want that.
This is the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
It's something I hope I never say
Yep.
because it's scary.
I will say too that there needs to be some people in your life that can speak into your situation in your heart, because otherwise it is so easy to slip back into what you prefer and what you want. And I think that's a big part of application because I'm not a believer that you should have 10 people that speak into your situation in your life, but there needs to be a few outside of even your spouse probably that can just call you on your situation and say, "Hey, you're not right here." I think that's really important.
The preacher you grew up under in St. Louis, Ben Merrill, Matt. I remember
Not
Ben
you.
Merrill saying,
Sorry, that's not me.
Ben Merrill is 96,
7, something like that.
I don't know. I just heard him preach a sermon a couple of weeks ago, which is crazy. But Ben said one time at a I don't remember, revival thing I was at or something, that if there is not something in the service at church that I don't like, it wasn't a good service. I thought, I design everything because that's what I like, right? We got to be careful, and that's not exactly what's going on with these guys in the Sabbath. They have misinterpreted a lot of things historically, but they have settled in their comfort on. It's another problem: self-righteousness. Yeah, because there's a check and a balance to keeping rules and regulations in place, and we kind of know where we stand. And it's hard. It's hard sometimes as people to accept grace and mercy, and to know that it's enough. What Jesus did is enough, and that's where they're at. Well, it's an interesting discussion, and we're going to talk a lot about it on the 7th. We're going to make some specific applications to our situation in this COVID pandemic and what it means to return to worship. Be watching your email. You should be getting an email anytime now about what our specific plans are for returning to worship. But we don't want to return as we were. We always want to be improving. And so we're going to keep this online thing going. We're going to try to keep these discussions alive and well and interacting with you in different ways. We want to keep our emphasis on making disciples who make disciples and how to do that best. And so I hope when we do return to worship, we're all different than we were when we left. We'll see you then.